It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my very special guest is John Moore, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Blue Man. John, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
The honor is mine. I'm glad to be one of your shiny objects.
Well, and I'm glad we're finally able to have this conversation. My good friend Jason Jones has been talking to me about you for some time, but I know probably for my audience, which like I tend to do mostly nonfiction books, so authors that are in the fiction space, probably very new to many of the viewers and listeners. So we're going to kick this off by having you share a bit of the John Moore origin story. Like I said before we got into the interview, you're probably my very first official, real cowboy, let alone charismatic, prophetic fiction writing cowboy. So right off, we're off to a good start. But a good start. But tell us a little bit about your background and what are some of the things we should know about you.
Well, I was raised on a ranch here in Montana, third generation rancher. I was a newspaper journalist at the age of 17 for the local daily paper, even before I was a senior in high school. And then I was a seeker, and I got into drugs and the occult and Eastern religions and the New Age. And I hitchhiked 12,000 miles, all seeking. And my search ended in June 1973 when a woman led me to the Lord. And I had a couple of rough years following that because my hair was still below my shoulders and living in my hometown. And I wasn't particularly welcomed, in the area churches at the time, or at least didn't feel that way to me. And uh, got a little rough. I married a wonderful spirit-filled woman in 74. But the big difference for me came in 1975 when I received a very dramatic baptism in the Holy Spirit. And very dramatic. We can go there sometime if you want. But for the novels and the writing, I've known since high school that I was going to write novels about my life. I had a little short vision probably when I was a freshman, even in high school, but no handle on that. And then 1984, my wife Deborah and I were in a movie theater in Billings, Montana, watching the movie Cross Creek, which is the story of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And in this movie, the famous editor Maxwell Perkins comes to visit her, and he hands her a pile of manuscripts that she submitted to him and said, these are junk, you know. And he was the most famous editor of, 20th century probably. And then he brought out her letters. And he says, but these letters about this land and the people you know are wonderful. Write what you know. And when that actor said those words, the Holy Spirit came on me so strong that my face dropped down into my hands, into my lap, and tongues just poured out of me. And I kept it quiet as much as, we're in a small Cracker Jack movie theater, but it just was an awesome, anointing. And so I slowly began, and I hired an editor. Uh, but not long after that, we were shipping early because of drought, shipping cattle. And I was riding up a hill on a particular horse. I can go right to the hill. And the Lord spoke to me in my chest in a voice that was not mine. And he said, the breaking of Ezra. And it's like, wow, because I did not have a title for my novel. I didn't even have the protagonist named yet. And all of a sudden he's named, and, so I worked 2 years on that. Had a diagnosed with a terminal liver disease about that time, and worked 2 years on it and came out with kind of a self-published novella. And I had major houses in New York City interested, all the big ones. But they all said, you're promising, but this doesn't really meet our needs at this time. So after 30 rejections, I prayed and fasted. And back in Pleasantville, New York, an editor of Reader's Digest, where I had been published, was visited by a woman from Lion Publishing UK, opening an office in America. And as she was leaving, he handed her his copy of The Breaking of Ezra and said, here, you need to publish this. And she called me about a week, 10 days later, and it told me who she was. And I already knew, this editor had called me. And she said, we want to publish this, but you have to double it in length. And we can't offer you a big advance. And I said, well, that's fine. I know what you're going to offer me. And of course, she goes, oh, yeah, I said, yeah, $5,000. And she goes, yeah, you're right. So I had to go from about 50,000 words to about 105, 100,000. And I had to write in our ranch bunkhouse with only heat that I had, and this through the winter, was a space heater blowing on my leg. And got it done. And it won the Critics' Choice Award from Christianity Today, and won, it was runner up for a Golden Spur Award from the Western Writers of America. I'm told it placed first on 2 out of 3 ballots. And in that interim, in through all of that, I went with some cowboy Christian friends to Oklahoma to pick up some stock trailers. And we made a side trip through Springfield, Missouri to Bill Britton's House of Prayer. And the Spirit fell on us. And it fell on us so hard that it took me almost 2 days to get to church, because it fell on us in the house where we were staying. We were staying with a young pastor who later went and joined Mike Bickle when Mike first really got going in Kansas City. And finally, I made it to the meetings. And they've been going on like maybe, certainly 2, maybe 3 nights. And there was a rhyming prophet up at ministering to a childless couple. And he's saying unto them, and I will put many arrows into your quiver. Then he turned and he looked through about 3 pews of people to me, and my friend and I had come in late, looked me right in the eye and said, and I will even heal your liver. And from there, over a period of a couple of months, and it's all documented with VA paperwork, my liver was totally healed, and it was expected to be terminal, but totally healed, and I don't even carry a blood titer. There's no evidence that I ever had the ailment. So after that, I published Lion UK Folded in America, and Ezra kind of bounced around, ended up at Thomas Nelson, where I also did a novel, Bitter Roots, and then I did the subsequent Ezra first 2 of the trilogy, Leaving the Land and The Limits of Mercy. And meanwhile, I did a book with Zondervan, a nonfiction, which also ended up at Thomas Nelson and all this. But in this process, all right, then book 4 in the Ezra series, I published in 2014, and I self-published it because I've been under contract to 8 publishers, published by 6. I've had 3 agents. I mean, I'm an old veteran of all this. I mean, my publishing experience and working with Christian houses goes back into the 70s. The very first Christian Writers Conference I attended, when I walked into the hotel, the lobby, young Christians were arguing whether Christian fiction was moral, whether you should write Christian fiction. So that's how far I've come. And I went back to that same conference the next year as an instructor, 1978. So, and there I met, I know you have ties here, a young lady, an editor at Bethany House. And she and I worked on a novel that I'd started right after I came to the Lord in 73. It was probably too far out there for anybody at that time. It got cleaned up a little or tempered down and published by Broadman and Holman, later on as The Land of Empty Houses. Now, Blue Man, I began in 2015 or 16, and it's really pivotal in Blue Man to know who the president of the United States is. And I remember thinking it's going to be Hillary. So I'm writing it this way. All of a sudden, bang, And I went through a lot of self-doubt. I've got letters in my files from Pulitzer Prize winners, saying, we like your work. We like you, and yet my road in Christian publishing and writing had been difficult. And I'm saying maybe I'm no good. Maybe I'd had it prophesied to me a time or two that I was supposed to write nonfiction. and I've disobeyed because, it's in your heart, and I'm accountable to that. I'll listen to it, but I'm not answerable to it. And this was often by people who probably didn't like fiction, and they saw my talent and they wanted it elsewhere, use it elsewhere. So I got into Blue Man, and I would start and stop, start and stop. I was really struggling. Then last October, a friend of ours in Alabama, who I've never met, but she's become a good friend, sent me a prophetic word. And it was a very pointed one. And it was the Lord saying, get that book done. And some other very pointed, direct, nothing general, nothing you say, well, that could be this or this could be that. And so I really took it on myself. And starting about January 1st, I'd feed cattle in the morning. And then I spent about 5 hours a day, 4 to 6 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3.5 months, and only took 2 days off until I had finished Blue Man. And it certainly did go places that I wasn't expecting. And one thing about my novels is I know you have to end the book powerfully. And I've taught writing seminars and everything. And this is usually what I tell young writers. You have to end each chapter powerfully, but the end, boy, you can't just dribble off. I mean, it has to be a kapow, but not overly done. It has to hit you in the spirit. And I didn't know it all centers around a dream that the president has, a nightmare, recurring nightmare for 8 nights. Ezra Riley, the main character, who is me, I won't deny it, uh, gets summoned out of the hills of Montana to come interpret this dream because all these other people had tried, ministers, doctors, psychiatrists, and it's the president, so they're trying to keep it low key. Ezra doesn't really care if he goes or not. And that's one of the strong messages. This is a multi-layered book, all right? You can get messages, you could read it 3 or 4 times and pick up new things in it, I think. And that's what I'm told by, reviewers and readers. And one of the messages in this is that Ezra is determined not to be a professional Christian. He is determined not to use this experience to puff up his head, and he has to sign a non-disclosure agreement not to write about the experience. But he's not even tempted to. He's got this old horned cow in the hills he's trying to capture, and that's where his mind is. And he's going to do this, and he's going to do it properly. And that's what the whole book kind of centers around, plus an aging CIA agent who's based on a real man. All right. People won't believe that. But yeah, my wife lived for a while when she was a young hippie and before she came to the Lord in Florida with a CIA agent and his wife. And he was a professional psychic for the CIA, basically. And so he was kind of the model, only much, much, much older in this. And this CIA agent creates, because he's been cut off from the psychic programs that the CIA had, the best known one being MK Ultra. Uh, and he creates his own. He has the money, he creates his own. And he takes 2 psychics and he has them have a baby, and he takes the baby at birth and conditions it, raises it up in a controlled atmosphere to become a psychic warrior. And so it becomes basically a battle between this Blue Man and Ezra Riley, an aging cowboy who just wants to stay horseback in the hills.
Well, and I want to get into the book here in a little bit, but I want to pull in a couple more threads from your backstory because there's just so many different places we could go. You said getting baptized in the Spirit was a very dramatic experience. I'd love to hear about that. What did that look like for you?
Well, after I got saved, after spending so much time in the occult and New Age, I'd seen a lot of dramatic things, believe me. 12,000 miles of hitchhiking, and not only staying with, communes and staying with witches and warlocks and just anything on the road, having a knife at my throat twice, a gun in my chest. I mean, you name it. And so I get saved. And I go to churches. And I remember the first time I went to this Pentecostal church, made a dear friend that first night there. And I asked him after the service was over, I says, well, when do we do the good stuff? Because I wasn't raised in a church. All right. He said, when do we do the good stuff? And he says, well, what? And I said, well, healing the sick and raising the dead and stuff like that. And he goes, oh, well, we don't do that. I thought, oh boy, so I just didn't fit in. And I started drifting back, in my hometown and young, and drifting back to the hippie crowd. And I was never a drug user for the sake of just being a hedonist. I was a searcher. Well, now I've found what I was searching for, but I'm not being accepted and I'm not seeing any life in anything. And I meet Deborah and marry her, but I'm still just really struggling. And I finally struggled to the point that one time in an act of stupidity, and I don't even know how this came about, but I dropped a hit of acid, and I had done a lot of hallucinogens, which is also a theme of Blue Man because the CIA used them extensively, and it was cut with something, as we say, and I don't know what it was cut with, but it was bad stuff. And I had keys to a doctor's house, a spiritual leader in the town, and because I used to caretake their home, and they were gone. And I got into his little black bag and took some downers, and that was a bad, bad deal. And finally, much later, my Deborah was walking me around in the night air, rebuking the spirit of death. I probably refused to go to the hospital. Should have had my stomach bump, but much of it would have been too late. And a friend of mine, who's a model for the character Jubilee Walker in Leaving the Land, he was a preacher's kid, Pentecostal preacher's kid. And he was in a church in Albuquerque that was very dramatic and really on fire. And he was home, and Deb called him, and he came over and he started preaching to me. And I am seriously on a bad trip. And I finally looked up at him and I said, just shut up, you little glorified preacher's kid. And that's what I said. And tell me how to get it. And we walked over to a city park and prayed, and nothing dramatic happened except I looked up in the night sky and one star twinkled and a beam of light came down and hit me in the chest, but I didn't feel any impact from it. But I clearly saw it. Well, the next night he was preaching in his father's little church there, and Deborah and I were going. And on the way, we saw a young gal I knew who had been in the occult too, and somewhat with me. I mean, we had a relationship, and she was very naturally psychic and was drawn, to all that. And we just happened to ask her to come with us. So she did. So we're sitting down in the front pew, Deborah to my right, and then me, and this friend to the left. And my friend is leading worship. And during worship, I received my prayer language, just by, I'm singing in English one moment and singing in my prayer language the next. And then we sat down. And as we sat down, I felt her fingers digging into my forearm, the young gal on my left. And I hear her. I turn to her, and she's staring at my friend Gary, who's now beginning to preach. And she goes, "John, I want to kill him." And I said, "No, I won't mention her name, but no, you don't. But those demons inside of you do." Because even, while I was kind of backslidden and all that, I'm still reading Don Basham. I'm reading Pigs in the Parlor. I'm reading voraciously because I've always read voraciously. And I knew how to, cast spirits out. And I said, "No, but those demons do." And that she whirled around, got both hands around my throat and started squeezing with supernatural strength. I mean, it was like iron, but she could not close. All right. That's kind of the key. She could grip me. Well, I was a martial artist and was probably at the peak of it then too. And I knew to bring one hand up between hers, but instead of trying to break the grip, which I may not have been able to do, I just brought it up, a couple fingers up, laid it on the forehead, on her forehead, and commanded that spirit out. And it screamed like a wet mountain. I mean, it almost raised the whole roof. And this is in front of this small, Pentecostal, group. And that was, that's how I came to be baptized in the Holy Spirit.
Well, I think you win for most dramatic baptism in the Holy Spirit encounter to date. I'll let you know if somebody can top that one, but that
I
that
hope they
gets
do.
that gets 10 stars in my opinion. One last thread I want to pull from in your origin story, and you had sent me a bunch of kind of bullet points of themes we could riff off for the conversation. You talk about having a couple of angelic encounters. I know my audience would love to hear about those as well.
I have not talked about this in ever, except to
Okay.
close friends. I did mention it on an interview with two delightful guys out of California, junior high teachers that have a podcast. Wonderful guys. I mentioned it briefly to them, but yeah, I've had I've had a lot of supernatural experiences, and it would, I'd have to sit down and write them all. But the angelic ones, right after I came to the Lord, I started going into trances against my will. I mean, I would feel it coming on, walk across the room and collapse on the bed and be gone. And I'd be flying through space and not knowing that I was ever going to come back. And uh, seeing, demonic eyes. And I mean, I knew it was bad, you know, and I didn't know what to do. I'm like a week old in the Lord. And this went on, and the woman who led me to the Lord would finally, I would hear, she would be on her knees, at the bed saying, John, call on the name of Jesus. And this would take a while until I could finally hear her. And it was like a million miles away. And then I would, I'd call on the blood of Jesus and the trance would end. Well, this went on and on and on. And I never knew, when it might hit. And finally, one day I came out here to the ranch and I was in a kind of a little bunkhouse place where I slept. And I was laying on the bed taking a nap, like mid afternoon. This is comical. I mean, I love this story. I can tell it like it happened to somebody else because I just love it so much. And it was so long ago. But I'm laying there on my stomach with my head turned and something brushed against my back. And it kind of semi woke me up, kind of into the hypnagogic type of state. And there were two beings above me. I could feel and tell that, there are two of them. And the one looked down and said in exact words, "Oh, I'm sorry. It had brushed me accidentally and woke me up. Oh, I'm sorry. We're taking something from you, but you'll get it back." And when an angel speaks to you, it's so filled with peace. You don't have to stop and say, "Well, should I discern this?" You know, do you claim Jesus? I mean, it's just radiating peace. And I just went, "Oh, okay." And as I drifted back to sleep, I felt a hand enter the back of my head, just go in. And I slept quite a while. And when I woke up, all of my memories and interest in the occult, and I had a lot of experiences. Okay. So all those memories were gone, totally gone. And I had a young gal at a little youth meeting hand me a new age kind of book. And she said, "Here, what do you think of this?" And I just looked at it and I had no interest in it at all. I just handed it back to her. And it just did not interest me in the slightest. Now, I had that honeymoon for about 2 months. And like I say, the angel said, "You will get it back." And I got it back, and almost as dramatic of a way, because a woman at this youth meeting took me into a room alone and left me with a recording she was sure I would love. And it was wolves howling. And they had a super expensive stereo. And I mean, it was like being surrounded by wolves. And I did not like the recording. I thought this is pretty demonic. And all of a sudden I turned and I could sense a demon sitting in a chair. And that surprised me because this is a Christian youth leader. I'm thinking, what are you doing here? And the demon spoke to me and simply said, "I'm back." And all my memories, just like that, boom, which is fine because I draw on all those experiences for years, in the deliverance ministry and counseling, all of that. We've pastored 3 home churches. And so we've counseled a lot of people that, some pastors might not one to counsel. And now the second one happened about 20 years ago. I was in a prophetic presbytery, and most of your viewers probably know what one is, but it's a gathering of prophets and prophetically potential prospects coming, and you pray and seek the Lord, and people are ordained into the office of a prophet through this process. And I believe there were 100 of us like applicants there. All right. And only two of us were chosen, me and this young lady who was going to Africa as a missionary. We were called forward, and we had like 100 people laying hands on us and praying in the spirit. I mean, that alone is just, wonderful. And I left there, that was the first night, went to my motel room, uh, went to bed. And the moment my head hit the pillow, I was gone, just, and I've listened to a couple of your guests, um, Mr. Woodford, I believe, and Ivan, uh, two of these guys that have gone to heaven and hell. And one of them mentioned the warp speed thing, the Star Trek thing. Well, he's whew, precisely right. I can remember as I'm leaving, I thought, I'm flying through space and the stars are just going whoosh, 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 past me. And the next thing I know, that was in the wintertime in another state, is where I was sleeping. Next thing I know, though, I am on my ranch in the summertime, and this angel is flying with me, and I'm yoked to it. Wherever it goes, I go. And it's communicating with me telepathically. Now, I can't see it, but it's like in my head. I mean, it's talking to me, and it's very, they're very pleasant. They're peaceful. They have a sense of humor. And where the angel said, look up at the sun, John. Now, this part is in Blue Man. And I want people to understand that when I write, I am authentic. My cowboy stuff is authentic. The acid trips, stuff of the CIA is authentic, and the supernatural is authentic. I base it on real experiences. I'll change it for the shape of the book, but the angel told me to look up the sun. Well, the sun is hugely oversized. And down at one little corner, well, not a corner, but like at 6:30 on a clock, a small black square, really pretty small. And the angel said, John, do you see that square? And I said, yeah. He says, well, that's your fears. And whenever you're under that shadow, you're in the shadow of fear. And I mean, it was small compared to the sun, but if you're in the shadow of it, that's all you're going to really feel. And the next thing I know, so we come up out of that, and I see a cloud coming. Now I can go to the ranch and point out these places, and I see this, what we call a divide, where a ridge line that separates watersheds. It's called a divide. And I see what we call the 3 divide, because it's on section 3. And here comes some dust, and here comes this rumbling thing. And this angel says, there's the enemy. Do you want to buzz him? Well, that was a test. I flunked the test. Because I said, oh, no, no. I responded not so much in fear, but in caution. Don't provoke the enemy for no reason, kind of thing. Well, I'm yoked to an angel. What do I have to be afraid of? I failed the test. Well, the angel didn't care. He says, and he takes off. I mean, this is like an F-15. And we come down over what looked like, now I can't explain, all right? But it was like a World War II tank with a B-17 bubble on it, the ball turret bubble. And you could look down into it. And I mean, we buzzed down so close. And this thing was clanking along. You thought it was going to fall apart. And I could see the creature driving it. I mean, I could look into his eyes. And it raised up a hairy fist. Now, what did it look like? I'll tell you this. Very, very close to the orcs in the Lord of the Rings. And I've had two other prophets tell me they've seen the same creature. All right. I think J.R.R. Tolkien had been places and seen some things because for three prophetic people, including a big name prophet, all right, tell you, yeah, I've seen exactly the same thing. And it wasn't exactly like an orc, but it was so close and big muscled forearm. And it shook its fist and glared, it snarled at us. And we banked out of there. And the angel, again, with this sense of humor, said to me rather wryly, aren't you glad he doesn't have the weapons we have? And before I could respond, it was Star Trek all over again. And now stars just flying by. And the next thing I know, I just pop up out of bed, in a different state in the nighttime, in the winter. And I grabbed the phone and called my wife right away. And I said, you've got to listen to all this. I've got to get it down. I got to write this down. So at the end of this, Blue Man, where Ezra Riley has, somewhat of a similar uh, experience, that is based. I don't, I won't make up stuff that might not be scriptural. Uh, I won't play. I'm very serious about fiction. Okay. I want to write fiction like The Breaking of Ezra Riley, where I can say it has changed lives, it has impacted lives. I know of two children that were named Ezra, two firstborn sons, because that book impacted them so greatly. Now, you would think, having won awards and how it's impacted lives, that everybody would know about The Breaking of Ezra Riley. And there is kind of a small cult following. Unfortunately, a lot of the books got accidentally destroyed, uh, so they're not available. But the problem is, I have fallen, since the Lord came upon me in that movie theater 37 years ago. If you live a prophetic life, you're going to be 20, 30, 40 years ahead of the curve. So Christian writing wasn't ready for me. The readership, wasn't ready for me. The cowboy world wasn't ready for me. I fell in the cracks because the Christians, they see a cover with a horse on it or something. They think it's an 1880s Western, Shane meets Jesus, one of those typical ones, and that's not me. And there was no realistic fiction back then in Christendom. And so that was a problem. Now, the cowboy world, because these were all published by Christian houses, they kind of, nah. And I had one magazine editor after I queried him and showed all the credits, publishing credits, literary awards, multiple awards for journalism and for novels, et cetera, and published in the New York Times Magazine and blah, 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 blah. And he wrote me back and he said, well, with your credits, you can't be a real cowboy. And I can't win, So with Blue Man, as I got to really saying, all right, I'm going to finish this book, and all these times of being published years ago by more mainstream houses and having to kind of hold things in, I thought, the heck with it. I'll be 69 tomorrow. All right. So back in January, I said, the heck with it. I'm just going to let her rip. And one thing I can address you as as an editor, I have mentioned this to, a lot of prophetic people. And I said, do any of you know of a book of a prophet writing about being a prophet in his hometown? Jesus mentions it in each gospel. So it has to have some significance. But I've never even had an answer from these guys. And these are the guys that you and I would talk about and all know. And they just kind of look at me because who lives in their hometown anymore in this transitory society? I do. And so I thought, the heck with it. I've been kind of secretive about a lot of things, and I'm getting old enough now. Who cares? So I just really kind of let it fly.
Well, let's jump now into kind of your ideas, inspiration for this particular novel. I always find it kind of interesting when somebody is able to do life with a character over a series of books. At least in my experience interviewing authors, I often find they'll get an idea that'll start somewhere and it kind of germinates in their mind for a while, and eventually they have this idea that could become a full book. And so I'm curious in terms of the premise for Blue Man. When did that idea first take root? And I'm curious to hear like what inspired it. Obviously, you inspire the character, but kind of the theme of this particular book, where does that come from for you?
Well, I administered in home churches long before it was popular, and we did it out of necessity. Our town did not even have a non-denominational charismatic church. Okay, so we just by kind of necessity started a Bible study that turned into kind of home church, and then we went back into the organized church again, and then we started another one, in and out kind of a deal, and so I done a lot of prophetic ministry, and that's what I love. I love words of knowledge. I love giving people words of knowledge that change their life. And I've done it to strangers. I'll tell you sometime about this airplane trip. But anyway, I had the idea finally. I thought I might kill Ezra off because it's you got the breaking of Ezra Riley, leaving the land, the limits of mercy, looking for Lynn, 4 Ezra Riley books. And I thought, well, I want to write one more. I might just kill him off. And I don't have a huge, fan base, but the ones I have are very loyal. And I mean very loyal. And they were like up in arms when they kind of heard about it. You can't do that, and you can't do that. And I thought, well, I might have to so I can get to writing something else. And I always knew because I have given prophetic words to a few major ministers. All right. And I won't mention them or anything, of course, but, I'm trusted enough and that, you know, I can call them on the phone and say, I have a word for you, and they'll receive and welcome the word. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? My wife has always joked that someday we'd have dinner in the White House. So she's trying to improve my manners. John, quit licking the plate. But I said, yeah, the proverb says your gift will make room for you and bring you before great men. And when that happened to John the Baptist, he got his head cut off. So it might not be such a great thing going to the White House. But it got me to thinking, what if Ezra, who becomes a dream interpreter, and it's mentioned in Looking for Lynn, what if he goes to the White House to interpret a dream for the president? And what are the ramifications of all that? And, an interesting character in the book, they're all based on somebody, I take 2 or 3 people and mold them into one, you know. And was this Mary Margaret Hall, who's a woman of means, but she's like a professional prophetic intercessor. And I believe the real glue in the world right now is small town prophetic intercessors, big city ones too. But the word pagan, have you ever thought or looked it up? It meant, the original meaning meant country dweller. And rural people have always been kind of looked down on. And even before Christ, the word pagan meant country dweller. And during the times of Christ, they used the roads that the Romans had built to get from one big city to the other. But they didn't go into the small villages and to the farm. You don't see Paul writing to the farmer at, you know? I mean, they're being efficient. They're going to the big cities and establishing churches. Well, farmers always being dependent on rain, and we're in a millennial drought here right now in the West. Worst drought, they say, in 1,000 years. Well, they how Baal worship got going was fertility rites, needing rain. And because of worshiping false gods, as to bring in rain, this is how the country dwellers got thought of as superstitious followers of false gods. And so the pagan just literally meant country dweller. And then later it involved more of the word of not being a Christian, because a Christian was a soldier of Christ and a pagan was a civilian. So it has that meaning as well. But there's always been something through culture where the agricultural person was kind of looked down at as being uneducated and kind of a hick and made fun of. And it happens today, even if you have advanced degrees and you have the internet, and if you happen to farm or ranch, you know. Um, but I really believe that there are prophetic intercessors scattered throughout this nation, many of them in small towns, many of them forced out of the churches they were in by pastors that could not and would not understand them. And they are on their knees interceding daily, you know, for leaders, for America, for the world, right now for Afghanistan. And I don't know, I kind of got off on a bunny trail there. You know, you were wanting more to know. But see, Mary Margaret Hall is a woman of influence, you know, money, and she can travel wherever she wants. But what she does is spend as much time as she needs praying, you know, in that area. And I didn't plan on having her in the book. She was simply going to recommend Ezra Riley to her sister, who is a little more, you know, involved in a diabolical political process. But once, you know, sometimes you bring a character in and they just say, I'm here, you know, make room for me. And of course, I have Barney Wallace, who's called Barnwall, and he is like almost 100% my good friend Wally Badgett, who's a cowboy cartoonist, former professional bull rider and professional saddle bronc rider, went to the National Finals Rodeo. Uh, and he's the wackiest, low key wacky. I mean, he's got a sense of humor like you'd never believe. In his cartoons, he does calendars. I don't have one right here handy, but I mean, he's a superb artist and he is wittier than all get out. Well, Ezra is intense and serious. And so you need comic relief. So I introduced Barney Wallace in Looking for Lynn. I was going to bring him back for a cameo. Sure enough, old Barney, you know, just blows the doors off, says, let me in here. And he becomes the key because he's Ezra's sidekick and he's more of the evangelical. All right. Ezra doesn't, he keeps his cards pretty close to the chest. He's obviously, you know, charismatic, apostolic, prophetic, kingdom minded, but he doesn't talk about it much, you know, and so he meets his friend on his level where he is. And so that's kind of how some of all that came about. That one character, Davis Brown, was based on two people, one I knew and one I just knew through the media. You know, again, becoming a conglomerate. It was fun with his mother, who's like this overly religious woman, but who becomes very likable at the end. You know, Davis Brown hates religion because of his parents. And I make her kind of a wacko Pentecostal. Now, come on, we all know him, you know. And I had one woman in mind who's been long gone, who was a lovely lady and very sweet, but she was tall and slender and just spouting religious stuff all day long. And I just said, okay, you know, you're now Davis Brown's mother.
Well, we've touched on a range of supernatural elements that are in the book, and you've given us some kind of background for how they fit into your life, and obviously transition into the story. Obviously, with a work of fiction and a novel, there's the actual story that's unfolding, but more often than not, the author's woven in some sort of a core truth or eternal truth that they want their readers to pick up on in the story. So, in terms of Blue Man, like what's the timeless truth, the connection point to God? Like what's the core thing you want your readers to discover as they're enjoying the story?
Well, I don't think there's one. Again, my novels are so multi-layered that people are going to come in at whatever depth they decide to go to is where they'll find their core truth. And I've had numerous readers respond that they can't get this book out of their head. You know, they've read it and for days they're there. You know, for days they're hearing these characters and they're thinking about something. And I believe it needs to be read 2 or 3 times so that you can get deeper because at points the suspense is going to catch you. The pacing, some of the witticisms, the comedy, the humor of Barney Wallace. You know, these kind of things, the danger of Blue Man, suspense of Blue Man. And the messages are coming through I like fiction because you suspend the disbelief system, right? People relax. You let stuff go deeper. Now, with nonfiction, being didactic, you naturally tense up a little. You think, I got to learn this. I have to study this. And you're a little bit more tense. So I like to catch people unaware. I like the unsaved to say, that's a great story. And then maybe a month later, they're thinking, oh, yeah, God does speak to people. I wonder if he'd speak to me, at this level. Now, one of the things I think I'm trying to bring out is Ezra is confronted by Mary Margaret Hall at one point, and he rebukes her a little for it. That she says to him, now, are you a Jonah who doesn't want to minister to his people, or are you a Samson? And part of the book is written for the Samson. I came through the Jesus movement. I mean, I came to the Lord in 73. I wasn't directly impacted by it, but it was around me, especially in my hitchhiking. I was aware of Chuck Smith and Lonnie Frisbee and everything that was taking place. And a lot of those people had trouble once we got into the 80s and 90s and all of the me first stuff, And a number of them, I'm sure, fell away. And I've always had this message on my heart since the 80s that many of those will have a chance to come back and be blinded and silent and chained, but have one last push against the pillars, and kill more Philistines in that action. So part of it is a call onto the Samson generation. Part of it, and this is what I firmly believe. We cannot launch and a great awakening with 1950s methods. Our youth today, the society today is so much more corrupted, especially what the 60s introduced, what I saw, what I saw, and I saw a lot, all right. What came through is still here. Spirit of New Age, the Hindu religion, really came in, and people don't see it much. They don't talk about it. But a Hindu philosophy has never left America. And it came in through the Beatles and, the Hare Krishna. And I attended a very liberal college in California for a while too. And some of my instructors were these kind of people, hair down to here and rainbow suspenders and studying Sri Aurobindo, was who we were studying. Well, if we're going to have this great awakening, it will not be a 1950s style of the four spiritual laws. All right. It's going to be demonstrations of power because the average citizen today doesn't even know what you're talking about if you had mentioned the four spiritual laws, and they don't want to be preached to, but they sure like to get healed. And when they're blown away by a word of knowledge, they're healed of something deep inside. When they're weeping and crying and messing up your shirt, yeah. And that's part of Blue Man, is we're in this intense power struggle. And Ezra, the other thing is, and this is never talked about, Ezra is physically, mentally, and spiritually tough. That's not ever really embraced. And, we just don't think about it. But I mean, he's an aging cowboy that goes through a lot at the end of that book. And he could just give up, and die. But there's a grit to him, a manliness that goes all through and into his core. And we have been domesticated to the point that we're just lapdogs as men and Christian men. And that's the other thing about Ezra. He knows there's a thin line between determination and stubbornness. And if he crosses it once in a while, he doesn't really care. And one thing he's stubborn about, and this is real, is the danger of technology. And I would recommend a book called something, oh golly, The World as We Know It is Going to Change or whatever. I mean, it's written by a Christian science journalist, and I should have it at the top of my head. Wonderful book saying we can't stop what's coming. And this is a top science journalist. And he is saying, bango, I mean, pretty soon it's all going to be artificial intelligence. and people are going to be stoned on something all the time just to keep them sedated, you know. And Ezra sees all of it. So he knows that the spiritual world is more powerful, and so does the bad guy, William Anderson Hall. Spiritual world is more powerful than the technological world. And pretty soon the technology is going to break into the spiritual world. Well, it's going to be about half lost with a whole lot of lost people with it and open up portals for a lot of demonic power. And so the Ezra Rileys have to be out there and rising up in a way that they can say the spiritual has dominion. Christ has dominion. The angels have commissioning. And so it's all in there.
Well, and what I love about what you just shared is that you're giving us a character we can look up to, a character that we should aspire to be like. And I feel like that's something in terms of popular media, movies, TV, books. There's been a big shift in storytelling where the people we're being asked to look up to, or it's the anti-hero who becomes the hero, or the bad guy becomes the hero, and the good guy that we really should look up to, they're somehow the villain, and it's very upside down. And so I appreciate that you're giving us a character that we can look up to. And then in terms of reaching the next generation, I feel like there's often a divide between generations, sometimes communicating things. But the reality is when it comes to culture, many people didn't have the benefit. Those of us who grew up more around church or got to go to Bible college, whatever the things might be, culturally, people have way less exposure to church and Christian ideas. And so to think that, how we try to evangelize people or deliver the gospel, not that the gospel is insufficient in any way, but in terms of really communicating a message, if we're trying to pull on the same things that we did in the 80s and 90s, we do need to realize that culture has shifted. What people connect with, what they're worrying about, some of those things have changed. And so while we're certainly communicating the same gospel message, it might look a little different than it did back in the day. And so anytime we can really examine that and really figure out how to effectively communicate to the up and coming generations, I think that's a powerful thing to wrestle with and think through. John, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about your range of books, where do we discover you? Where do we discover those on the web?
Well, I hate to say it, but you almost have to go to Amazon and you'll find Looking for Lynn and Blue Man are readily available. The Breaking of Ezra Riley is on Kindle. The Land of Empty Houses, which is not an Ezra Riley book, is on Kindle. But Leaving the Land, The Limits of Mercy, and Bitter Roots are not, and they are hard to find. Well, they're not hard to find, but you have to find them through used, bookstores and stuff, through Amazon and other. Abe's Books will have them. Also, my nonfiction book. I wrote a book called Letters to Jess, which then got picked up by Zondervan and printed as Loosening the Reins, which then got picked up by Thomas Nelson and released as Take the Reins. I've had a very unique publishing career, and they're out there now. My desire is that a lot of these books will come back into print, and if there starts to be a demand, maybe they will. And the Lord told me to write The Breaking of Ezra Riley. He never told me it'd be a movie, or any of these would be. But I have had 3 movie contracts in my career, and none of them went into production. And there's stories behind all of that too, believe me. But yeah, they're out there. They can be found.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes to places where you can pick up Blue Man and links where you can check out some of the other books as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with John Moore. Once again, our book today was Blue Man. And John, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have
I
you on
want
the
to
show.
show them the cover because I love the cover. My daughter found this print on Etsy.